Margaret Thornfield moved through the grand estate like a ghost, her soft footsteps barely audible on the polished marble floors. At 34, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill that had become both her survival mechanism and her greatest weapon in the Thornfield family dynasty. The morning sunlight streaming through the towering windows of the family mansion seemed to pass right through her, as if she were nothing more than another piece of furniture in the opulent rooms. Before we continue with Margaret's incredible story of hidden strength and ultimate triumph, I'm curious about our viewers today. Where are you watching from? Whether you're tuning in from a bustling city or a quiet small town, drop a comment and let us know your location. Stories like Margaret's happen everywhere, and I'd love to know where our community spans across the globe. The Thornfield estate buzzed with an energy that felt both solemn and electric. Richard Thornfield Sr. had passed away just 3 days ago, and today the family had gathered to pay their respects before tomorrow's will reading. Margaret understood her role perfectly. She was to be seen but not heard, present but not acknowledged, useful but never valued. She carried a silver tray laden with crystal glasses filled with aged whiskey, moving from group to group of expensively dressed relatives who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the patriarch's legacy. Richard Thornfield Jr., her husband of 7 years, stood near the grand fireplace with his siblings, Victoria and Charles. At 41, Richard possessed the kind of commanding presence that came from a lifetime of inherited privilege. His tailored black suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his confident posture suggested a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Margaret approached their circle quietly, extending the tray toward the group. Victoria Thornfield Maxwell barely glanced in Margaret's direction as she plucked a glass from the tray. At 38, Victoria had maintained her socialite beauty through expensive procedures and exclusive spa treatments. Her designer morning dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her diamond earrings caught the light with every dismissive head shake. She continued her conversation without pause, as if Margaret were merely a piece of automated serving equipment. The topic of discussion made Margaret's chest tighten with familiar humiliation. Victoria was explaining to a group of cousins why Margaret's presence at family gatherings was merely tolerated rather than welcomed. She comes from absolutely nothing, you understand. Richard met her at some charity event where she was serving food to homeless people. We all thought it was just a phase, but he actually married her. Can you imagine? Charles Thornfield, the youngest at 35, laughed at his sister's cruel assessment. His laugh was the kind that echoed through country clubs and boardrooms, confident and dismissive. Charles had inherited his father's sharp features and his mother's complete lack of empathy. He adjusted his gold cufflinks and added his own commentary to the character assassination. She's harmless enough, I suppose. Keeps the house running and doesn't cause trouble. Richard could have done so much better, but at least she knows her place. Margaret's hands remained steady as she held the tray, though her heart pounded against her ribs. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times over the years, but the words never lost their ability to wound. She moved away from the group, her expression carefully neutral, and approached another cluster of relatives near the grand piano. Eleanor Thornfield, the family matriarch at 73, commanded attention from her throne-like armchair near the bay window. Her silver hair was styled in an elaborate updo that had probably taken hours to perfect, and her black dress was adorned with the kind of jewelry that belonged in museums. Her piercing blue eyes missed nothing, and her tongue was sharper than any blade. She beckoned Margaret over with an imperious wave. "Margaret, dear, we'll need you to handle the final arrangements with the caterer for tomorrow. Make sure they understand that presentation is everything. The Thornfield name has a reputation to maintain." Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. "Also, please confirm that the flowers in the guest rooms are fresh. I noticed some wilting this morning, and that simply won't do for tomorrow's reading." "Of course, Mrs. Thornfield." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, the practiced tone of someone who had learned that the safest response was always agreement. She had long ago stopped trying to remind Eleanor that she was also a Thornfield now, at least in name. The correction had never been well received. Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though not with warmth. It was more the satisfied look of someone whose orders were being followed without question. "You're a good girl, Margaret. You understand your role in this family. Some people are meant to lead, and others are meant to serve. It's the natural order of things. The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air like expensive perfume, overwhelming and inescapable. Margaret nodded politely and moved toward the kitchen, her composure intact despite the familiar ache in her chest. She had become an expert at swallowing her pride, at absorbing insults with the grace of someone who had no choice but to endure. In the kitchen, Margaret busied herself arranging more refreshments on silver platters. The staff members who worked for the family treated her with a kindness that her own relatives by marriage never showed. They understood what it meant to be invisible in plain sight, to be essential yet expendable. Maria, the head housekeeper, offered Margaret a sympathetic smile as they worked side by side. The sound of approaching footsteps made Margaret look up from her task. Harrison Webb, the family's longtime attorney, appeared in the doorway. At 62, Webb had the distinguished appearance of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex legal needs of wealthy families. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive suit suggested success and discretion in equal measure. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thornfield." Webb's greeting was professional and polite, one of the few people who consistently used Margaret's married name with proper respect. "I wanted to confirm the arrangements for tomorrow's will reading. We'll be gathering at my office at 2 o'clock sharp." Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and faced the attorney directly. "Yes, Mr. Webb. I believe everyone has been informed of the time and location." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I'm not certain my attendance is expected or desired." Webb's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. "Oh, I think you'll find your presence is quite necessary, Mrs. Thornfield. Quite necessary indeed." His words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to their surface meaning. But before Margaret could ask for clarification, Webb had already turned and walked away. The afternoon wore on with Margaret continuing her invisible service to the family. She refilled glasses, cleared away empty plates, and listened to endless conversations about the deceased patriarch's business empire and the family's expectations for tomorrow's will reading. The consensus among the relatives was clear. Richard would inherit the bulk of the business operations, Victoria would receive the family jewelry and perhaps a generous cash settlement. Charles would likely get the summer properties, and Eleanor would be provided for comfortably in her remaining years. Margaret's name never came up in these discussions, except occasionally as an afterthought. Someone might wonder aloud whether she would continue to maintain the household or if the family would need to hire professional staff. The assumption was universal that Margaret would receive nothing of significance, if anything at all. She was, after all, not really family in the way that mattered to people like the Thornfields. As evening approached and the last of the visitors departed, Margaret found herself alone in the grand dining room, clearing away the final remnants of the day's gathering. The silence felt oppressive after hours of conversation that had swirled around her without ever including her. She moved methodically, stacking plates and folding napkins, her movements automatic and efficient. Richard appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled from a long day of playing the grieving son. He watched Margaret work for a moment before speaking, his voice carrying a tone of casual authority that had become second nature over the years of their marriage. "You don't need to worry about attending tomorrow, Margaret. This is family business, and it will be complicated enough without having to explain your presence to people who matter. You can spend the day here, maybe organize Dad's study or something useful like that." Richard's dismissal was delivered with the same casual indifference he might use to discuss the weather. Margaret's hands stilled on the crystal glass she was holding. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, an expression that was gone too quickly for Richard to notice. When she looked up at him, her features had returned to their usual placid acceptance. "Of course, Richard. Whatever you think is best." Richard nodded, satisfied with her compliance, and left the room without another word. Margaret stood alone among the expensive furniture and family portraits, surrounded by the trappings of a wealth and power that she could never truly be part of, no matter how many years she spent serving this family's needs. But as she continued clearing the table, Margaret's movements carried a subtle confidence that would have surprised anyone who bothered to really look at her. Tomorrow would bring revelations that none of them could imagine, truths that had been carefully hidden behind years of practiced invisibility and strategic silence. The quiet mouse they had all dismissed and forgotten was about to remind them why the most dangerous opponents are often the ones you never see coming. The morning of the will reading dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself sensed the dramatic events about to unfold. Margaret stood in the kitchen at 5:30, preparing breakfast for a family that would soon discover just how catastrophically they had misjudged her. The familiar routine of scrambling eggs and brewing coffee felt different today, charged with an anticipation that made her fingers tremble slightly as she arranged fresh fruit on expensive china plates. Victoria swept into the kitchen at 7 sharp, her silk robe flowing behind her like battle armor. She had already applied a full face of makeup despite the early hour, her appearance flawless as always. Her excitement was palpable as she poured herself coffee from the sterling silver pot that Margaret had polished just that morning. Victoria's voice bubbled with barely contained glee as she launched into her calculations. "I've been thinking all night about what Father might have left me. The jewelry collection alone is worth at least $2 million, but I'm hoping for cash as well. There's this divine penthouse in Manhattan that just came on the market, and with my inheritance, I could finally leave this dreary estate behind." Victoria stirred sugar into her coffee with aggressive enthusiasm, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. "Charles thinks I'm being greedy, but Father always said I had the most refined taste in the family." Charles entered the kitchen moments later, his hair still damp from his morning shower and his expensive cologne announcing his presence before he spoke. At 35, he possessed the kind of confident swagger that came from never having been denied anything he wanted. He grabbed a piece of toast from Margaret's carefully arranged plate and bit into it while outlining his own grand plans. "The summer house in the Hamptons is practically guaranteed to be mine. Father always said I was the only one who truly appreciated its potential. I'm already talking to architects about expanding the guest wing and adding that infinity pool I've been dreaming about." Charles gestured expansively with his coffee cup, completely ignoring Margaret as she quietly refilled his plate. "Once I get my hands on the inheritance, I'm thinking of turning it into an exclusive resort. The profits alone would set me up for life." Eleanor made her grand entrance at 7:30, her silver hair perfectly styled and her morning attire impeccable despite the early hour. She commanded attention simply by walking into a room, her presence filling the space like expensive perfume. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had ruled this household for decades as she issued her morning pronouncements. "Margaret, dear, you'll need to pack your personal belongings today while we're at the reading." Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than evicting her daughter-in-law. "I've already spoken with Maria about preparing the guest cottage for you temporarily. It's quite generous, really, considering you have no legal claim to anything here. We'll give you a month to find suitable alternative arrangements." The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air like a poison cloud. Margaret continued preparing breakfast, her movements steady and controlled, but something flickered behind her eyes that none of them bothered to notice. She placed a fresh plate of eggs Benedict before Eleanor with the same quiet efficiency she had shown for 7 years, her voice remaining soft and compliant. "Of course, Mrs. Thornfield. I understand completely." Margaret's response was exactly what they expected, the submissive acceptance that had characterized every interaction they had ever had with her. She had learned long ago that fighting back only brought more punishment, more humiliation, more reasons for them to justify their treatment of her. Richard joined the family gathering at 8, his presence immediately commanding attention from his relatives. He wore his grief like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored and designed to impress the right people. His voice carried the weight of someone already planning to step into his father's shoes as head of the family dynasty. Today changes everything for this family. Richard helped himself to coffee and pastries while Margaret stood silently by the counter. "Father built something incredible, and now it's my responsibility to take it to the next level. I've already been in touch with the board of directors about implementing some changes I've been planning for years." Richard's confidence was absolute, his assumption of inheritance so complete that he spoke as if the will reading were merely a formality. Margaret moved quietly around the kitchen, refilling coffee cups and clearing away empty plates. Her presence had become so familiar that the family members barely registered her existence as they continued their increasingly excited speculation about their pending wealth. She might as well have been a piece of kitchen equipment for all the attention they paid to her contributions to the conversation. The moment that would later seem like a turning point arrived when Margaret quietly mentioned something that had been weighing on her mind. "Excuse me, but I wanted to mention that I used to help your father with some of his business correspondence in the evenings. He often asked for my input on various matters, and I thought perhaps that might be relevant somehow." The kitchen fell silent for exactly 3 seconds before erupting in the kind of laughter that could strip paint from walls. Victoria nearly spilled her coffee as she doubled over with amusement, her perfectly applied makeup threatening to run from the tears of laughter streaming down her cheeks. The sound was sharp and cutting, designed to wound and humiliate. "Oh my goodness, Margaret," Victoria gasped between fits of laughter. "You think helping father address Christmas cards qualifies as business consultation? That's absolutely precious." Charles joined in the mockery, his voice dripping with condescension as he explained why Margaret's delusions were so amusing. "Father probably asked you to lick envelopes or organize his desk drawer, and you somehow convinced yourself you were a business advisor." Charles shook his head in mock sympathy. "It's actually quite sad how you've built up these little fantasies to make yourself feel important. The reality is that father barely knew you existed, just like the rest of us." Richard's response was the cruelest of all because it came wrapped in false kindness. His voice took on the patronizing tone someone might use with a confused child. "Margaret, sweetheart, I know you want to feel like you belonged in father's world, but you have to understand your limitations. Business is complicated, and father dealt with million-dollar decisions every day. Your little contributions were probably just him being polite." The humiliation crashed over Margaret like a cold wave, but she absorbed it with the practiced grace of someone who had endured years of similar attacks. Her face remained carefully neutral as she continued clearing the breakfast dishes, but her hands moved with a precision that suggested suppressed emotion. She nodded politely at Richard's explanation and continued her work without protest. Eleanor decided to deliver the final blow with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly where to cut deepest. "Margaret, dear, this is exactly why tomorrow will be so difficult for you. You've spent years building up these romantic notions about your place in this family, but tomorrow you'll have to face reality." Eleanor's voice was almost gentle, which made the words even more devastating. "You're not one of us, and you never will be. It's better that you understand that now." The morning continued with more of the same casual cruelty disguised as family discussion. They debated whether Margaret should be allowed to keep any of the jewelry Richard had given her during their marriage, with Victoria arguing that expensive pieces should remain in the family bloodline. Charles suggested that Margaret might make a suitable housekeeper for whoever inherited the main estate, though at a significantly reduced salary since she would no longer have family status. As the family prepared to leave for the law office, Margaret excused herself to make a phone call. She stepped into the small alcove off the main hallway, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she dialed a number from memory. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of professional tones that would have surprised anyone who overheard it. "Yes, everything is proceeding exactly as we discussed. The arrangements are all in place for this afternoon." Margaret's voice carried a quiet authority that had been completely absent during her interactions with the family. "No, there have been no complications. They suspect absolutely nothing. Thank you for your patience with the timeline. I know this has been a long process, but today everything changes." She ended the call quickly and rejoined the family in the foyer, her demeanor returning to the submissive silence they expected. Richard barely glanced at her as he announced that she would not be accompanying them to the reading, as if this decision were as natural as breathing. The family departed in a convoy of expensive cars, their excitement palpable as they drove toward what they believed would be their financial coronation. Margaret stood in the doorway watching them leave, her expression unreadable. As soon as their cars disappeared around the circular driveway, something shifted in her posture. The submissive slouch straightened into confident bearing, and her eyes sharpened with an intelligence that had been carefully hidden for years. She walked back through the house with purpose now, no longer the invisible servant, but someone who moved through these rooms as if she owned them. Which, in just a few hours, she would discover was exactly the truth. Margaret spent the remaining morning hours reviewing documents in the study, her movements precise and professional as she organized papers that would soon prove more valuable than any of them had imagined. When it was time to leave for the law office, Margaret dressed carefully in a simple black dress and modest jewelry. She looked exactly like what they expected her to be, the grieving widow who knew her place and accepted her circumstances. The perfect disguise for someone about to detonate a bomb that would destroy everything they thought they knew about power, wealth, and family hierarchies. She arrived at Webb & Associates 15 minutes early, slipping into the elegant law office building without fanfare. The receptionist directed her to the large conference room where the reading would take place, and Margaret chose a seat in the back corner, exactly where someone of her perceived status should sit. She folded her hands in her lap and waited with the patience of someone who knew that the most devastating surprises always come to those who wait. The family arrived precisely on time, their confidence radiating through the office like heat from a furnace. They claimed the front row of chairs as if it were their birthright, speaking in hushed but excited tones about the formalities ahead. None of them acknowledged Margaret's presence, just as she had expected. Today, their blindness to her existence would prove to be the most expensive mistake of their lives. Harrison Webb's law office possessed the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted about wealth and power. The conference room where the Thornfield family had gathered featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city skyline, mahogany paneling that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and barely suppressed greed as Webb prepared to reveal the contents of Richard Thornfield Sr.'s last will and testament. Webb himself cut an impressive figure at the head of the polished conference table. At 62, he possessed the distinguished bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex legal needs of America's wealthiest families. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, and his gold-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light as he arranged his documents with methodical precision. He had conducted hundreds of will readings over his career, but this one promised to be unlike any other. The family had arranged themselves according to their perceived hierarchy of importance. Richard sat directly across from Webb, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed himself about to inherit an empire. His black suit was perfectly pressed, his hair was styled with expensive products, and his expression suggested a man who was merely waiting for formalities to confirm what he already knew to be true. He drummed his fingers quietly on the leather portfolio he had brought to take notes about his new responsibilities. Victoria had chosen the seat to Richard's right, her position strategic and deliberate. She wore a designer black dress that managed to be both appropriately mourning and subtly celebratory. Her makeup was flawless despite the emotional weight of the day, and her jewelry was chosen to complement whatever pieces she expected to inherit. Her eyes glittered with barely contained excitement as she imagined the jewelry collection that would soon be hers to enjoy and display. Charles occupied the chair to Richard's left, his casual confidence suggesting someone who had never doubted his place in the family hierarchy. His expensive watch caught the light as he gestured while whispering to his siblings about the business opportunities that would soon be available to them. He had already mentally redesigned the Hamptons house and calculated the rental income from converting it to an exclusive resort property. Eleanor commanded attention from her throne-like position at the far end of the table. Despite being 73, she maintained the regal bearing of someone who had ruled society circles for decades. Her silver hair was styled in an elaborate arrangement that had probably required 2 hours to perfect. Her black dress was adorned with understated but expensive jewelry, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the room with satisfaction. Margaret sat exactly where everyone expected her to sit, in a simple chair along the wall behind the family's main seating arrangement. She had chosen a modest black dress and minimal jewelry, her appearance perfectly calibrated to reinforce their perception of her as unimportant and forgettable. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap. Her expression was appropriately somber, and her posture suggested someone who understood that she was present only as a courtesy rather than as a participant. Webb cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings with the kind of measured authority that comes from years of practice. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering today for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Thornfield Sr. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for all of you, and I appreciate your patience as we work through these important matters together. The preliminary formalities felt endless to the eager beneficiaries. Webb explained the legal framework for the will, confirmed the validity of the document, and outlined the process they would follow throughout the reading. The family members nodded politely at these explanations, but their attention was clearly focused on the moment when he would begin announcing the actual distributions of wealth and property. Webb began with the smaller bequests, his voice taking on the formal cadence that lawyers use when reading legal documents. To Maria Santos, who served our household faithfully for 22 years, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my sincere gratitude for her dedication and kindness. To James Patterson, our groundskeeper, I leave $25,000 in recognition of his excellent care of our properties. These announcements were met with polite nods from the family. Such bequests were standard and expected, small acknowledgments of service that demonstrated appropriate generosity without impacting the significant wealth that would flow to blood relatives. Victoria smiled approvingly at this display of her late father-in-law's magnanimous nature, while Charles calculated that such gifts still left the vast majority of the estate available for the real inheritors. Webb continued through the list of minor beneficiaries with methodical precision. Various cousins, longtime friends, and charitable organizations received modest sums that ranged from $10,000 to $100,000. Each announcement reinforced the family's expectations about the hierarchy of importance. These were the appetizers before the main course, pleasant acknowledgments that served to highlight how much wealth remained for the truly significant inheritors. Then Webb reached the portions they had all been waiting to hear. To my daughter Victoria Thornfield Maxwell, I leave the complete collection of family jewelry, including all pieces inherited from previous generations as well as those acquired during my lifetime. This collection has been professionally appraised at $2.4 million and should be maintained within the family for future generations to treasure. Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. Her eyes immediately brightened with triumph as she exchanged excited glances with Eleanor, who nodded approvingly at this confirmation of family traditions being properly maintained. Victoria's mind was already racing through the possibilities. She would finally have access to the legendary Thornfield emerald necklace, the diamond tiara that had been worn by 3 generations of family matriarchs, and dozens of other pieces that represented not just monetary value, but social status of the highest order. Webb continued without pause, his voice maintaining the same measured formality. To my son Charles Thornfield, I leave the summer residence in the Hamptons, including all furnishings and the surrounding 5-acre estate. I also leave him the sum of $1 million to ensure proper maintenance and enjoyment of this property. Charles could barely contain his satisfaction as this announcement confirmed his most optimistic expectations. The Hamptons house was worth at least $4 million on its own, and with the additional cash bequest, he had just inherited enough wealth to transform his entire lifestyle. His mind immediately turned to the architectural plans he had already begun sketching, the infinity pool that would overlook the ocean, and the exclusive events he could host for the social elite. Eleanor's bequest followed naturally, announced with the same formal precision that Webb had used for the others. To my beloved wife Eleanor, I leave an annual income of $200,000 for the remainder of her natural life, to be paid monthly from the estate's investment returns. I also grant her lifetime residence rights in the main estate, ensuring she will always have a home befitting her status and dignity. Eleanor accepted this news with the gracious nod of someone who had expected nothing less. $200,000 annually would maintain her lifestyle comfortably, and the residence rights meant she would never have to leave the estate where she had reigned for so many decades. The arrangement was generous and appropriate, exactly what someone of her position deserved from a loving husband's final wishes. Webb then turned his attention to Richard, and the room's energy shifted noticeably. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the announcement that would confirm Richard's transformation from heir to patriarch. The business empire, the primary residence, the bulk of the family's liquid wealth, all of it was about to pass to the eldest son who had spent his entire life preparing for this responsibility. To my son Richard Thornfield Jr., I leave control of Thornfield Industries and all related business operations. I also leave him the primary family residence and grounds, along with the sum of $3 million to facilitate his new leadership responsibilities. Richard's face broke into the kind of smile that only comes from having one's deepest expectations fulfilled completely. The announcements had proceeded exactly as the family had predicted. Each member had received not just what they hoped for, but more than they had dared to expect. The total value of these bequests represented serious wealth, the kind of generational inheritance that secured lifestyle and status for decades to come. Victoria was already mentally cataloging which pieces from the jewelry collection she would wear to upcoming social events. Charles was calculating the timeline for his Hampton House renovations. Eleanor was satisfied that her comfortable lifestyle would continue uninterrupted. Richard was planning his first board meeting as the new head of Thornfield Industries. Margaret remained motionless in her corner chair, exactly where someone of her perceived importance should sit during such proceedings. None of the family members had glanced in her direction during the reading of these major bequests. Her absence from the significant distributions was so expected that it wasn't even noteworthy. She was part of the furniture, a witness to their good fortune, but certainly not a participant in the family's wealth transfer. Webb paused deliberately, shuffling through additional documents with the kind of careful attention that suggested more business remained. The family members exchanged satisfied glances, assuming that any remaining items would be minor administrative details or final charitable bequests. Richard was already reaching for his portfolio, preparing to take notes about the practical next steps for assuming control of his inheritance. However, there are additional provisions we must address. Webb's words cut through the comfortable satisfaction that had settled over the room like expensive cologne. The lawyer's tone had shifted subtly, taking on a more formal register that suggested the truly important business was just beginning rather than concluding. The family's attention sharpened noticeably. Victoria's hand paused halfway to her purse, where she had been reaching for her phone to share the good news with friends. Charles stopped calculating renovation costs and focused completely on Webb's carefully neutral expression. Eleanor's satisfied smile faded slightly as she recognized something in the lawyer's demeanor that suggested unexpected developments ahead. Richard leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from satisfied recipient to concerned participant. The pause in Webb's presentation had lasted just long enough to create a subtle tension in the room, an anticipation that felt different from the excited expectation they had all felt just moments before. Webb arranged his papers with deliberate precision, his movements suggesting someone who was preparing to deliver information that would require careful handling. The afternoon lights streaming through the conference room windows seemed to dim slightly, as if the city outside was holding its breath along with the Thornfield family. Margaret remained perfectly still in her corner position, but something almost imperceptible had changed in her posture. Her hands were still folded quietly in her lap. Her expression remained appropriately subdued, but there was a quality of alertness about her now that hadn't been there during the earlier portions of the reading. She sat like someone who was waiting for a very specific moment to arrive. Someone who knew exactly what was coming next in a story that everyone else believed was already concluded. The silence in Webb's conference room stretched like a taut wire about to snap. The family members sat frozen in their leather chairs, their earlier satisfaction replaced by a growing unease as they watched the attorney's careful movements. Webb reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope that bore the unmistakable weight of significance. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to dim, as if the city itself was holding its breath for what would come next. "Margaret Thornfield, please step forward." Webb's words cut through the tension like a blade through silk. The request was so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of what anyone in that room had imagined possible, that for a moment nobody moved at all. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand froze halfway to her throat, where she had been unconsciously touching the spot where her inherited emerald necklace would soon rest. Charles blinked rapidly as if trying to clear his vision of some impossible mirage. Eleanor's composed facade cracked slightly, her mouth opening in silent shock. Richard was the first to find his voice, though it came out strangled and confused. "There must be some mistake, Mr. Webb. Margaret has no legal standing in these proceedings. She's not a blood relative, and Father barely knew her." His words carried the desperate edge of someone trying to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away from his understanding. Webb's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "I assure you, Mr. Thornfield, there is no mistake. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield is specifically named in these additional provisions, and her presence is absolutely required for the completion of this reading." Margaret rose from her corner chair with a fluid grace that would have surprised anyone who had bothered to really look at her over the past 7 years. As she walked toward the front of the room, something fundamental shifted in her bearing. The submissive slouch straightened into confident posture. The hesitant shuffle became purposeful strides. The downcast eyes lifted to meet Webb's gaze directly, revealing an intelligence and strength that had been carefully hidden behind years of practiced invisibility. She took the seat that Webb indicated directly across from the family, and for the first time in 7 years, Margaret Thornfield commanded the complete attention of every person in that room. The transformation was so profound that Victoria actually gasped audibly, as if she were seeing a completely different person than the quiet servant who had spent years bringing them coffee and enduring their casual cruelty. Webb opened the manila envelope with ceremonial precision and withdrew a letter written on expensive stationery in the distinctive handwriting of Richard Thornfield Sr. "Before we proceed with the final provisions of the will, I must read to you a letter that Mr. Thornfield specifically requested be shared during these proceedings. This letter provides essential context for the decisions he made regarding the distribution of his estate." The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading in his measured, professional tone. "To my family and loved ones, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am no longer with you, and the time has come to reveal truths that I have kept hidden for the final years of my life. I must begin by acknowledging that the greatest mistake I made in my later years was not recognizing Margaret's extraordinary qualities publicly and giving her the respect she deserved from the very beginning." Victoria's face had gone completely pale, her earlier excitement replaced by a growing dread that she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Charles leaned forward in his chair as if trying to hear better, though Webb's voice carried perfectly throughout the silent room. Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, her composed facade cracking like expensive porcelain under pressure. Webb continued reading the letter that would shatter everything the family thought they knew about power, intelligence, and worth. 7 years ago, when Richard brought Margaret into our family, I was as dismissive as the rest of you. I saw her quiet demeanor and modest background, and assumed she was simply another pretty face who had captured my son's temporary attention. I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life." Richard's confident smile had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of growing confusion and fear. The business empire he thought he had just inherited suddenly felt less secure, less certain than it had just moments before. He watched Margaret's face for some sign of the submissive woman he had married, but found only calm authority and patient intelligence. Margaret, it turned out, possessed something that none of us had bothered to discover. Webb's reading of the letter continued with deliberate emphasis on each revelatory detail. She held a Master of Business Administration degree from the Wharton School, graduating summa cum laude with specializations in strategic planning and investment analysis. She had chosen to keep this credential private, believing that our family would accept her more readily if we saw her as non-threatening rather than accomplished. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Victoria's mouth fell open in shock as she struggled to reconcile this information with 7 years of treating Margaret as an intellectual inferior. The woman they had mocked for suggesting she had helped with business correspondence suddenly possessed credentials that surpassed any of their own educational achievements. Charles actually laughed, but it was the kind of desperate laugh that comes from someone whose world is collapsing in real time. Webb continued reading, each word landing like a physical blow to the family's assumptions and arrogance. "For the past 5 years, Margaret has been my most trusted business advisor, though she insisted on maintaining complete anonymity in this role. Every major strategic decision, Every significant investment, every expansion into new markets was thoroughly analyzed by Margaret before I proceeded. Her insights were consistently brilliant, and her recommendations have been responsible for tripling our family's wealth during this period. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure finally cracked completely. The revelation that the quiet daughter-in-law she had treated as hired help was actually responsible for the family's financial success was so fundamentally contrary to everything she believed about social hierarchy that she couldn't process it. Her voice came out as barely a whisper when she finally managed to speak. This cannot be possible. This simply cannot be true. Webb reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a thick folder filled with documents, correspondence, and financial analyses. These are copies of Margaret's strategic reports, her market analyses, and her correspondence with our most important business partners and investors. Everything has been thoroughly documented, and I can assure you that every word of this letter is completely accurate. Margaret spoke for the first time since taking her seat at the table, and her voice carried a quiet authority that none of them had ever heard before. I never needed your recognition or approval for my work. I found satisfaction in helping build something meaningful, regardless of whether any of you understood my contributions. Her words were calm and measured, but they carried the weight of someone who had endured years of dismissal and humiliation while secretly holding the power to destroy everything they valued. Richard's face had gone through several color changes as the implications of these revelations began to sink in. The business empire he thought he understood, the wealth he believed he had inherited through birthright, the success he had attributed to his father's genius, all of it had been built on the strategic brilliance of the woman he had casually dismissed and planned to divorce. His voice cracked slightly as he tried to formulate a response that made sense of this impossible situation. Father never mentioned any of this to me. Richard's words sounded weak even to his own ears. If Margaret was really so important to the business, why didn't he tell us? Why keep it secret for so many years? Webb's response came with the precision of someone who had anticipated exactly this question. Your father's letter addresses that concern directly. He writes, I kept Margaret's role private because I wanted to see how my family would treat her when they believed she had no power or value to offer them. Their behavior toward her over these years has been the most accurate measure of their true character that I could have devised. The words hung in the air like poison gas, filling the room with the toxic realization that they had all been under observation and evaluation while they thought they were simply enjoying their natural superiority. Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual humiliation had been noted and recorded by the man whose approval they had spent their lives seeking. Charles found his voice first, though it came out strained and desperate. Even if that's true, even if Margaret helped with some business matters, that doesn't change anything about the inheritance. Father already distributed everything according to his wishes. The business goes to Richard, the jewelry goes to Victoria, I get the Hamptons house. What Margaret did or didn't do doesn't affect any of that. Webb's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since the reading began, he almost smiled. The look was not reassuring. I'm afraid you're quite mistaken about that, Mr. Charles. The provisions I just read were merely the preliminary distributions. The final and most significant portion of your father's will specifically addresses Margaret's unique position in this family and her contributions to your collective wealth. Margaret sat perfectly still as Webb prepared to deliver the information that would complete her transformation from invisible victim to undeniable victor. 7 years of patient endurance, strategic planning, and careful documentation were about to pay dividends that none of them could have imagined. The quiet mouse they had dismissed and forgotten was about to remind them why underestimating someone based on their apparent powerlessness is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make. Webb reached for the final section of the will, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the gold lettering on the legal documents, making them gleam like the instruments of justice they were about to become. The Thornfield family sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that nothing they thought they knew about power, wealth, or family hierarchy was about to survive the next few minutes of revelations. The most devastating surprises always come from the directions you never think to watch, and Margaret Thornfield had been waiting in plain sight for 7 years for exactly this moment to arrive. Webb opened the final section of the will with the solemnity of someone about to deliver a verdict that would reshape lives forever. The conference room had become a courtroom, and the Thornfield family sat as defendants awaiting a sentence they couldn't yet comprehend. The afternoon shadows had lengthened across the mahogany table, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the family's rapidly changing fortunes. Margaret sat with perfect composure as Webb prepared to read the provisions that would complete her transformation from victim to victor. Her hands remained folded calmly in her lap, but there was something in her eyes now that spoke of justice finally arriving after years of patient waiting. She had endured their cruelty, absorbed their dismissal, and documented their character with the methodical precision of someone who understood that revenge is a dish best served with overwhelming evidence. Webb's voice took on the formal cadence reserved for the most significant legal pronouncements. To Margaret Thornfield, in recognition of her extraordinary contributions to our family's success, and in acknowledgement of the grace with which she has endured unconscionable treatment from those who should have cherished her, I leave 85% of my entire estate, including all business operations, investment portfolios, real property, and liquid assets. The words hit the room like a physical force. Victoria's gasp was so sharp it sounded like she had been stabbed. Charles lurched forward in his chair, as if he had been punched in the stomach. Eleanor's face went completely white, her composed facade shattering like crystal hitting concrete. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his mind unable to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. Webb continued reading with relentless precision, each word driving the knife of justice deeper into their assumptions about power and privilege. The previous bequests to family members are hereby restructured as lifetime loans from Margaret's inheritance, subject to her complete discretion regarding terms, conditions, and continuation. Margaret Thornfield shall have absolute authority to modify, suspend, or terminate any financial arrangement with family members based on their conduct and character. Margaret spoke for the second time since taking her seat, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had just inherited the power to reshape lives. The loans are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Her words were calm and measured, but they carried the weight of absolute finality. After 7 years of careful observation and documentation, I have determined that none of you possess the character necessary to responsibly manage inherited wealth. Richard found his voice first, though it came out as a strangled plea rather than the commanding tone he had used all his life. Margaret, you can't be serious. This is our family's legacy. You can't just take everything away because of some hurt feelings. We can work this out. We can change. His desperation was palpable, the confidence of inherited privilege crumbling in real time. Margaret's response was delivered with the precision of someone who had planned this moment for years. This isn't about hurt feelings, Richard. This is about character, integrity, and the responsibility that comes with wealth. Your father spent 5 years watching how you treated someone you believed had no power, and your behavior convinced him that you lacked the moral foundation necessary to lead this family's enterprises. Victoria's shock gave way to rage as the full implications became clear. Her inheritance of jewelry, the social status it represented, the lifestyle it would have funded, all of it was disappearing like smoke. You can't do this. That jewelry belongs to the family bloodline. Those pieces have been passed down for generations. You have no right to steal our heritage. Her voice rose to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. Webb consulted his documents and delivered the next crushing blow with professional detachment. According to the restructured terms, all previously awarded items, including the jewelry collection, revert to Mrs. Margaret Thornfield's ownership. The will specifically states that bloodline inheritance is contingent upon demonstrating the character worthy of family legacy, which your father determined had not been established. Charles attempted a different approach, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone trying to negotiate from a position of complete powerlessness. Margaret, be reasonable. You know nothing about running a business empire. You'll destroy everything father built. Give us another chance, and we can prove we deserve to be part of this family's future. His appeal fell on ears that had heard 7 years of similar dismissals disguised as concern. Margaret's response carried the weight of accumulated knowledge and carefully suppressed intelligence finally allowed to shine. I've been running this business empire for 5 years, Charles. Every major decision, every strategic initiative, every successful expansion has been based on my analysis and recommendations. The only thing that will change is that I'll no longer have to hide my competence to protect your fragile egos. Eleanor made one final attempt to assert the authority she had wielded for decades, her voice shaking with desperation, masquerading as indignation. This is absurd. You cannot simply overturn generations of family tradition based on the whims of someone who doesn't understand our world. I demand that you reconsider this preposterous arrangement before you destroy everything we've built. Margaret stood slowly, her movement commanding attention throughout the room. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had just inherited the power to reshape destinies. Mrs. Thornfield, for 7 years you treated me like hired help while I generated the wealth that funded your lifestyle. You demanded I pack my belongings this morning because you assumed I had no claim to anything here. Your understanding of our world was fundamentally incorrect. Webb reached for his phone and spoke quietly into it. Within moments, 2 security officers appeared at the conference room door. Their presence transformed the elegant legal proceeding into something with the finality of a criminal sentence. The family members looked between the officers and Margaret with growing horror as they began to understand that their humiliation was about to become public and permanent. Margaret addressed the officers with calm professionalism. Please escort these individuals from the building. They are no longer welcome on any property owned by Thornfield Industries or its subsidiaries. Security at all family properties has been notified of this change in status, and they are not to be granted access under any circumstances. Richard's final plea came out as a broken whisper. Margaret, please. I know we haven't treated you well, but we can change. Don't destroy our entire family over past mistakes. We can learn to respect you. We can make this work. His words carried the desperation of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. Margaret's response was delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. 7 years was more than enough time for you to learn respect and character. You chose to use that time to demonstrate cruelty and entitlement instead. Your father gave you every opportunity to prove yourselves worthy of this legacy, and you failed completely. The security officers stepped forward, their presence making it clear that the time for negotiation had ended. Victoria clutched her purse as if it contained everything she had left in the world, which was closer to the truth than she wanted to acknowledge. Charles looked around the conference room like a drowning man searching for something to grab onto, but found only the wreckage of his assumptions about inherited privilege. As the family was escorted from the building, their voices could be heard echoing down the hallway. Victoria's protests about family tradition and bloodline rights. Charles's desperate attempts to negotiate some kind of compromise. Eleanor's shocked denials that such a reversal was even legally possible. Richard's broken pleas for mercy and second chances. Margaret remained in the conference room as the sounds of their protests faded into silence. Webb gathered his documents with the satisfaction of someone who had just executed a plan years in the making. The afternoon light had shifted again, and now it illuminated Margaret like a spotlight, highlighting the transformation from shadow to center stage. Webb broke the silence with quiet congratulations. Your patience and strategic planning have been extraordinary, Mrs. Thornfield. Your father-in-law would be proud to see justice finally served. The documentation you provided over the years made this outcome not just possible, but inevitable. Margaret walked to the window and looked down at the city street below, where she could see 4 figures standing on the sidewalk in obvious distress. For 7 years, she had been invisible to them, a shadow moving through their privileged world without recognition or respect. Now they were the ones who had become powerless, standing on a public street with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter taste of justice finally served. The quiet mouse they had dismissed and forgotten had just reminded them that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting with infinite patience for the perfect moment to reveal their true strength. Margaret Thornfield had endured their cruelty long enough to document their character completely, and now she possessed not just their wealth, but the moral authority that comes from having earned every bit of power through intelligence, patience, and grace under pressure. Justice had arrived exactly as it should, delivered by the person they had least suspected and underestimated most completely. 6 months had passed since the will reading that shattered the Thornfield family's world, and the transformation of their empire under Margaret's leadership had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The boardroom at Thornfield Industries buzzed with an energy that felt fundamentally different from the corporate atmosphere that had existed under the previous regime. Where once there had been fear and hierarchy, now there was collaboration and innovation. Where once decisions had been made through intimidation and inherited privilege, now they flowed from data analysis and strategic thinking. Margaret sat at the head of the polished conference table, her presence commanding respect through competence rather than birthright. At 34, she had stepped into her role as CEO with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment through years of strategic planning and careful observation. Her tailored business suit was elegant but practical, her demeanor was professional but approachable, and her leadership style reflected the perfect balance of intelligence and empathy that had been invisible to her former family for so many years. The quarterly board meeting was proceeding with the kind of efficiency that comes when decisions are made by people who actually understand the business they're running. Margaret reviewed the financial reports with the expertise of someone who had been analyzing market trends and investment opportunities long before anyone recognized her capabilities. The numbers told a story of unprecedented success under her leadership. Our revenue growth this quarter exceeded projections by 18%. Margaret announced to the assembled board members. The strategic initiatives we implemented in January have resulted in market share gains across all our primary sectors. Our employee satisfaction scores have reached historic highs, and our client retention rate has improved dramatically since we shifted to relationship-based rather than transaction-based service models. Board member Patricia Chun, a veteran of corporate leadership who had initially been skeptical about Margaret's qualifications, nodded with obvious admiration. Margaret, I have to admit that when the transition was first announced, some of us had concerns about such a dramatic change in leadership. Your results have been nothing short of extraordinary. The company culture transformation alone would have been worth the change, but the financial performance has exceeded our most ambitious expectations. Margaret's response reflected the kind of thoughtful leadership that builds lasting success rather than quick profits. The improvements we're seeing are the result of treating our employees as partners rather than resources and our clients as relationships rather than transactions. When people feel valued and respected, they naturally perform at higher levels. This wasn't revolutionary thinking, but it was consistently applied thinking, which made all the difference. The conversation turned to the employee profit-sharing program that Margaret had implemented as one of her first initiatives. The previous regime had operated on the principle that wealth should flow upward to ownership, while employees should be grateful for steady paychecks. Margaret's approach recognized that sustainable success required everyone to have a stake in the company's performance, creating incentives for innovation and excellence at every level. James Morrison, the chief financial officer who had worked under both administrations, provided additional context about the cultural transformation. The change in employee morale has been dramatic. We're seeing lower turnover, higher productivity, and significantly improved customer service scores. People actually want to work here now, which has allowed us to attract top talent from our competitors. It's become a virtuous cycle of improvement. Margaret's satisfaction with these results was evident, but her focus remained on future opportunities rather than past achievements. She had learned through years of observation that sustainable success requires constant adaptation and improvement rather than resting on previous accomplishments. The business world was constantly evolving, and companies that failed to evolve with it inevitably fell behind their more agile competitors. Outside the corporate success story, the consequences for the former Thornfield family members had been as permanent as Margaret had intended. Her network of contacts throughout the business community had ensured that their fall from grace was both public and lasting. The story of their treatment of Margaret had spread through social circles like wildfire, creating a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and entitlement. Richard had found employment as a junior sales associate at a competing real estate firm, but his reputation preceded him wherever he went. Former colleagues who had once deferred to his inherited status now treated him with the polite distance reserved for someone whose judgment had been fundamentally questioned. His income barely covered the rent on a modest apartment, a dramatic change from the estate lifestyle he had assumed was his birthright. The divorce papers had been filed within weeks of the will reading, and Margaret had declined any alimony arrangements, preferring a clean break from that chapter of her life. Victoria's attempts to maintain her social standing had crumbled along with her financial foundation. The jewelry collection that had been the centerpiece of her identity now belonged to someone she had spent years treating as inferior. Her invitations to exclusive events had dried up as her financial status became public knowledge, and her circle of friends had proven to be as shallow as her own character. She now worked as a sales associate in an upscale boutique, serving customers who possessed the kind of wealth and status she had once taken for granted. Charles had discovered that his business connections were entirely dependent on his family's financial backing rather than his personal competence. His plans for the Hampton House renovations had evaporated along with his inheritance, and his attempts to secure financing for independent ventures had been repeatedly rejected. He now worked construction jobs that required actual skills rather than inherited privilege, learning for the first time in his life what it meant to earn money through physical labor and genuine effort. Eleanor had perhaps suffered the most dramatic adjustment of all. The woman who had ruled society circles for decades now lived in a modest retirement community, supported by the basic social services she had once looked down upon. Her former friends maintained polite distance, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that had destroyed the family's reputation. The allowance that was supposed to have maintained her lifestyle had vanished along with the family's moral authority to claim inherited wealth. Margaret's personal satisfaction with these outcomes was tempered by her focus on building something positive rather than simply punishing past wrongs. She had established a scholarship program for women in business, particularly those from modest backgrounds who showed exceptional potential but lacked the financial resources to pursue advanced education. The program was named in honor of Richard Thornfield Sr., acknowledging his ultimate wisdom in recognizing character over privilege. The scholarship recipients met quarterly with Margaret for mentorship sessions, and their progress had become one of her greatest sources of professional pride. These young women possessed the kind of intelligence and determination that transcended social background, and Margaret saw in them the reflection of her own journey from invisibility to influence. She was building a legacy based on merit and character rather than inherited entitlement. As the board meeting concluded and members began filing out of the conference room, Margaret remained in her chair for a few moments, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this position. The grandfather's portrait had been moved to her office, where his wise eyes seemed to approve of the ethical leadership she had brought to his business empire. She often found herself speaking quietly to his image, sharing the challenges and victories of leading a company based on principles rather than profit alone. "What do you think, grandfather?" Margaret spoke softly to the portrait. "The quarterly numbers look strong, but I'm more proud of the culture we're building. People actually enjoy coming to work now, and our clients trust us to act in their best interests rather than our own. I think you would approve of the direction we're taking." Margaret stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city skyline. Somewhere out there, for people who had once held absolute power over her daily life now struggled with the consequences of their own character failures. She felt no malice toward them, only the quiet satisfaction that comes from justice finally being served after years of patient endurance. The transformation was complete, but it was not an ending so much as a beginning. Margaret Thornfield had emerged from the shadows to claim her rightful place as a leader worth following, and the empire she now commanded would be built on foundations of respect, integrity, and recognition that true strength often comes from the most unexpected sources. "The quiet ones are always underestimated," Margaret whispered to herself as she watched the city bustling below. "And that continues to be their greatest advantage." This brings us to the end of Margaret's incredible journey from invisible victim to undeniable victor. Her story reminds us that true power comes not from birthright or privilege, but from character, intelligence, and the patience to wait for justice to arrive. What did you think of Margaret's ultimate triumph? Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, triumph, and the surprising strength that can emerge from the most unexpected places.